You will recall that creating an animation in Tableau was relatively straightforward. All we had to do was drag the field that we wanted to use as the basis of our visualization into the pages shelf. In Power BI, all of this is a little bit more complicated, except for scatter plots or bubble charts. So to illustrate how this works, going back to the prison population database that we used in the previous module, I mapped total black population against incarcerated population and then used total population as the size on the bubbles for each of these counties. You will see that there is an additional field here called play axis. And it won't surprise you that if I drag any of the data, any of the fields that I have in my data source into that field, like I did for county out of the economic data, I now get what looks like a play button. And when I click that, then what's going to happen is that I gradually cycle through the different counties in the database that I have data for. But we can't really do that for other charts. So I've created a very simple clustered column chart that maps event date into the number of COVID cases. And you see that there is no additional fields here like a play axis that I can use. So the way we're going to have to solve that is by adding an additional visual. So we say get more visuals. That will open up a new window. If you haven't logged in before, then what you may have to do is first log in using your normal USF credentials. And then we're going to look for play axis. And that brings up play axis dynamic slicer, and it says working like a dynamic slicer. It animates your other Power BI visuals without any user interaction. So I'm going to say add. And then eventually that gets imported into my report. And you see I now have an additional icon here. Alternatively, what you can do is you can go to appsource.microsoft.com, search for play axis. You again see the same icons. Click on Get It Now. That will get you a file. Download the file, and then you can use that file to import the visual. So what I'm going to do now is put that play axis in my report, make it a little smaller, and then I'll pull event date into this. Again, change it to the date, the actual date, not the event hierarchy. And then what I can do is I can start playing. See, it grays out initially all of the columns that I have. Let me speed it up a little bit. So under animation settings, I can set this to 500, say. And then I'll play again. And as we get to the end of March, beginning of April, you'll see things start happening in the columns. So you see it starts highlighting one column at a time, right? Which is neat. So something is going on. There is some animation going on. But what I would like to do is do this not for column charts, but for line charts. So I'm going to change this to a line chart. And again, sorry, I made a mistake here. This should have been changed to a line chart. And that should still be a play axis with event date, so that's good. Now let me change this one to a line chart. All right, so, and now I'll play again. And you see what's happening. All I get is a single dot. Eventually that dot will start moving up and down because you see that we do change the date here, and eventually we're going to change the number as well. But that doesn't really show me what I want to show. And the reason, of course, is that Power BI dynamically adjusts both the y-axis and the x-axis. Well, that is easy enough to fix. So what I'm going to do is go into Format, and then I fix the y-axis so that we start maybe in, let's do January the 1st, and we end today. And then for the y-axis, we start at 0 and we end again at 2500. And now let's play again. And this is better because we now see the dot move along, right? So at least we have partly animated our line chart. But I would like to see a trace as well. And you will recall again that that was straightforward in Tableau. All we had to do is set the history on. You can't do that in Power BI. So what we're going to do in Power BI is something that is relatively complicated. First, we're going to create a new table with the dates in it, the field that we want to animate on, which in our case is dates. Then we're going to create a measure that compares the date in the line chart with the date in the slicer. And if the date in the line chart is earlier than the date in the slicer, that value will be set to 1, otherwise it will be set to 0. And what that's going to do, and then we put that as a filter on the line chart. So see what that's going to do, right? So if I have a date here that is before the date in the slicer, then the value of that measure, we'll call it days prior to or something, prior days, then that measure is going to be set to 1, and that column will therefore, or that point will therefore show. If it's later, then the value of that calculated measure will be 0, and therefore it won't show. So it's fairly complicated. We'll see how that's going to work. So the first thing we're going to do is in modeling, create a new table, which we're going to use called dates. And that simply consists of the event dates. And eventually that's going to be added, right? Let's go into the data model. It's here, and what we're going to do is, just in case, we'll rename this filter date. All right, okay, so that's good. And then what we're going to do in the slicer, we're going to remove event date, remove that field, and put filter date in, and again make that a real date. And now obviously when we're going to play, nothing is going to happen yet because we didn't make any connection between the line chart and the dynamic slicer, the filter. So what we're going to do now is create a new measure. We'll call that days before. And that's equal if the values of the event date out of the COVID data is before the values before the filter date, Then we're going to set that to 1. Otherwise, we're going to set it to 0. So again, see what happens, right? So assume that the filter date is February 16, 2020. Then everything that's earlier than 2020 in the line chart will get the value 1, and everything that is later will get the value 0. So what I'm now going to do is in this one, in the line chart, add an additional filter on days before, and we say if it's equal to 1. We apply the filter. And I did this in the wrong place, so let me undo this. So let me remove this filter. Try again. Put filter date in here. Change that again to the actual date. And then select the line chart. And then I'm going to put days before in here as a filter. Now, initially this will make it appear as if there is something wrong with my visualization, but see what happens when I start playing. See, eventually we'll start getting a nice trace. Okay, so that's good. Now, there is one other advantage of this. You will recall that when we did the moving averages in the COVID database in Tableau, we couldn't really do it because the moving averages required us to look over a number of pages at the same time. And because of the pages animation, we only got one page at a time. So we couldn't look at moving averages. Since we've now completely unlinked, so to speak, the date in the slicer and the date that we use in the line charts, see what happens if I move moving averages in here now. And then again play it. Move it along a little. And that you see, I now show both the object ID and the moving average. So while it is a bit more complicated to get these things done in Power BI, mapping, animating both actual cases and moving averages is more straightforward in Power BI than it was in Tableau.